The purpose of the previous video was to give us a basic introduction to clefs and their function in terms of representing various sets of notes along the range of high, middle, and low. And we ended the video by trying to dispel the idea that there is such a thing as transposing, quote unquote, between clefs, and that what looks to be a change of position, so to speak, is really just a function of recognizing that each clef represents a different set of 5 lines. So to illustrate that example, I think what we'll do is I'll just give us a note. Okay. Remember at the beginning of our discussion here, I gave you that note kind of without a clef, right? If you don't have a clef, you have no orientation in terms of where you are, so you can't really name the note. Well, now I've got a clef. I've got everything oriented, okay? And so now I should be able to name this note. So if I forget the clef for just a second, and I just take my note that I'm calling middle C here, and I count up from that, C, D, that helps me arrive at this thing here, which is actually an E. And here's how it's going to look in the treble clef. Within the treble clef, if I've drawn a treble clef, it's going to look like it's on the bottom line. It's crossing the bottom line of the staff, okay? So that's what it's going to look like there. But maybe I'm not always reading in treble clef. Maybe I'm taking that same E and I'm reading it on a C clef. Notice how the E is in the same place it was before. It hasn't moved. My perspective changes, though, if I'm going to look at the 5 lines centering on middle C, calling it the alto clef. Okay, it's still an E, but now it's going to look like it's not on the bottom line of the staff, but on the second line from the top of the staff, right, crossing through that line. Okay, whereas if I go to the bass clef, remember the bass clef, if I take the same note, move it over here, the bass clef shows me the 5 staff lines below middle C. As you can see, this note is actually outside that range, right? It's not within that. So how am I going to show this same E on the bass clef? Well, let's go back to the 5-line staff and we'll take a look at how that works. So here I'm on the 5-line staff. I have a bass clef here now, but I wanted to figure out where that E was. We remember that the E was outside the range of the staff. In fact, it was like two lines above where the staff is. So how do I figure that out? Well, this is where this idea of ledger lines comes in. Ledger lines are, remember that infinite series of lines we had? Even though only 5 lines are visible at a time on the traditional staff, sometimes ledger lines make what you could think of as like a cameo appearance. There are notes that exist somewhere outside the range of that regular staff, so we need to borrow some of those infinite lines temporarily, okay? So what we'll do here is remember the E was above middle C, and remember middle C was 1 line above where the staff range is for the bass clef. So that's middle C, but again, I need to go to the next line to find my E, okay? So E is actually crosses the second ledger line above the staff for bass clef. Okay, and so hopefully that helps gives you an understanding of what ledger lines for, right? They're not invented staff lines. They're not lines that just come up out of nowhere. They've been there theoretically the whole time, but we just don't see them all the time because we just want to keep ourselves oriented within the area of one clef. So that's kind of how that works. So again, coming back to our succession of lines here, remember we have the bottom 5 lines for bass clef, okay, and the E that we were talking about borrows a couple of staff lines, which is where those ledger lines come from. So that's kind of how it looks like there. But again, I just want to drive this point home. This note is an E, no matter what clef we're looking at it on. The note E above middle C is always in the same place. It doesn't ever move. What changes is our perspective with respect to which set of 5 lines we're looking at, depending on the clef. All right, so now to kind of drive this point home just a little bit more, here's what I'd like you to do. I'm going to take another note, not that E we talked about before, but another note that I'm going to put here, and I'd like you to take some staff paper and I'd like you to draw this note as it would appear in each of 3 of these clefs. Do the treble clef, do a C clef. It might be easiest to just do the C clef as an alto clef where middle C is right in the middle of the staff, and then do bass clef, and let's see where those land. All right, so here we are at the 3 clefs, and if we think back, that note was placed, if you remember, it was placed in the space just below where I had that red line running through. That red line denoted middle C. So a good starting point would be reminding ourselves exactly where middle C is on each of these 3 clefs. Remember, on the treble clef, middle C happens just below the range of that clef. So I'm going to need to borrow a ledger line in order to show that note just below middle C. Okay, so that's where middle C is. On the alto clef, middle C, I sometimes joke that the alto clef is the only clef that actually makes any sense because it actually put the middle C in the middle of the staff. I try to draw it there, right? So that's where our red line is here. And for the bass clef shows us the 5 staff lines just below middle C. So middle C is here, okay? Middle C has not moved. We have not moved middle C from being low to being in the middle of something to being high. It's in the same place. The clefs show us that we've changed our perspective. Okay, really, really important point. So again, that note we needed was in the space just below middle C. So if I know where middle C is, well, now I can draw that note. It's in the space just below. It's in the space just below. It's in the space just below. All of these are representations of exactly the same note in exactly the same octave, which of course in this case is B, right? B just below middle C. Hey folks, I'm just going to briefly interrupt myself here to draw your attention back to the B on the bass clef. Normally when I would write this B, I would write it without the ledger line. I'm using the ledger line here just because we're relating everything to middle C, but because this note occupies a space that's still kind of connected to the main staff, we would not need the ledger line. You don't need the ledger lines until the notes are so far away from the staff that they need to actually occupy that line or go beyond it. But for notes that are in the space just above or below a staff, we normally would not use ledger lines. So just wanted to clarify that. Okay, back to your regularly scheduled rant. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, I want to pause before I move on from this and to just kind of show you something that we see in music all the time. You'll see it in things in this class, you'll see it in other places. I drew each of these on their own sets of staves just to kind of keep it clear, but you won't always see it that way. Sometimes you will see things written, treble clef there, alto clef here, not the bass clef there. And drawing it this way, it's really convenient, right, in terms of just kind of saving space, but it kind of feeds this misconception that a lot of folks have that the note is somehow moving, right? Because visually it looks like this B jumped from being low to middle-ish to high. The B hasn't moved. What we've done here, again, it's very important to recognize that we've simply changed perspective. These 5 lines are not these 5 lines, not exactly, are not these 5 lines. They're a different set of that succession of 5 lines to kind of show us. In the case of treble clef, we use that to show high notes. In the case of the C clef, we use that to show kind of mid-range notes, and the bass clef, we use them to show fairly low notes, okay? But again, it's our perspective that's changing. I know I keep saying it because it's that important. It's a perspective that changes. The notes stay put.